Hey there. So today we're going to fill in our history of life notes. This is page 117 from your packet. So it should look like this. So make sure you have cut out these notes and glued them into your notebook. If you've not done that already, I would recommend pausing this video and gluing in your pages. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what early Earth was like. So it was very hot. There was a lot of volcanic activity going on, and there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. So all of life was anaerobic, meaning without oxygen. So these organisms were able to make energy. They just did it without the use of oxygen. And we learned, before that anaerobic organisms, while they can make energy, they cannot make a lot of energy. So life was very small. It was very slow. Right, and we can kind of see down here in our primitive C that we've got a lot of methane, a lot of nitrogen, hydrogen, radioactive materials. So it's not a very hospitable place to live, right? Volcanoes going off all the time. So not a place where you and I could survive. But the things that were living right on this early Earth were bacteria, right? Specifically anaerobic bacteria, right? And we know that bacteria, right, also known as prokaryotes, right, meaning no nucleus. So the first things in this early Earth that were able to survive the intense solar radiation, right, the noxious gases that were coming from volcanic activity, right, they were anaerobic bacteria. So where did life come from, right, kind of as we know it? Well, there were two hypotheses about where life kind of started. The first hypothesis is called abiogenesis. So the word bio, we know, means life, right? Genesis, kind of, meaning beginning. And then a, right, is Latin for without. So beginnings of life, basically without other life. So abiogenesis is also known as spontaneous generation. And it's this idea that living things came randomly from non-living things. So, few hundred years ago, we thought that, where mice came from is you took basically your dirty laundry, and you chucked it out onto the street where it mixed with other, water and wheat, and you gave it some time, and then suddenly that dirty laundry turned into mice. So you took non-living things such as your dirty laundry, and you waited, and suddenly it would turn into mice. We know today that that's not exactly where mice come from, right? Mice give birth to other mice. So this hypothesis did not hold sway for very long until we found our actual hypothesis that we know is true today, called biogenesis, or the idea that living things come from other living things. So we'll talk about how we were able to prove biogenesis and disprove abiogenesis here in a second. So we also, we're going to talk about Miller and Urey. So this idea that biogenesis, living things come from other living things, really started to take off from this experiment of Miller and Urey. So they basically simulated Earth's early atmosphere, right, that we talked at the beginning. It was very hot, full of methane, nitrogen, right, and absolutely, no oxygen really what to speak of. Very, very little oxygen. So they recreated, right, this early Earth's atmosphere, and then they shocked it, right, with electricity, right, that spark. And from that experiment, they were able to make the very first amino acids that we know are the building blocks of proteins, which are an essential macromolecule for life. So Miller and Urey's experiment really started to disprove that hypothesis of abiogenesis, because we were able to prove that we could make those first amino acids, right, from which all life is from in early Earth conditions, right? You get the right gases, you get just that right spark, right? From obviously there wasn't electricity. This is from lightning, right? They were simulating Earth's early atmosphere, and they discovered that it could have created amino acids, which all of life is built on. So again, they were trying to see if the ingredients on Earth could have triggered abiogenesis. Why would Miller and Urey have made sure to not use oxygen in their experiment? Remember, the first organisms on Earth, right, were anaerobic bacteria, because there was no photosynthesis. There's no plant life yet. So there's no oxygen in the atmosphere. So Miller and Urey made sure to not use oxygen in their experiment. What do you think the shocks of electricity in the experiment represent? Well, we said that was the lightning, right, from Earth's atmosphere, the lightning. So another experiment that helped us to disprove spontaneous generation was by Reddy. He basically took meat and put it in an uncovered jar, and after a couple of days, maggots showed up, because they were attracted to the meat. And then he did this experiment again. He took, right, the same type of meat, put it in the same type of jar, but now he put a lid on it, right? And so he proved that the maggots did not come from the meat, right? The meat did not turn into maggots. The maggots were attracted to the meat, which means the maggots came from somewhere else. So he disproved spontaneous generation. A few years later, Pasteur, he didn't really like Reddy's experiment. He wanted to do his own experiment, which is great, right? In science, we always need to test each other's experiments and make sure, yeah, I do agree with your idea. So Pasteur kind of amended Reddy's experiment, but instead of using meat, he used a broth, which he thought would kind of would be a little bit better to use. So he boiled some broth, and he had this flask on here with this kind of S-shaped. And when that neck was on the flask, the broth remained free of microorganisms, bacteria. And he left it like this for about a year, and the broth remained free of bacteria for a year. And then after a year, he removed that curved neck, right? He just kind of broke it off. And within a few days, the broth was teeming with bacteria. So again, Pasteur disproved the idea of spontaneous generation, because the broth remained free of bacteria for over a year because they couldn't get through the tube. But the minute he pulled that curved neck off, bacteria were able to float in, right, kind of from the air and enter that broth. So quick reminder, right, when we talk about evolution, right, we're talking about species changing over time, right, and we're talking about geologic time, so hundreds of thousands and millions of years. There were two kind of ideas about how evolution worked. We're going to talk about Lamarck's theory and Darwin's theory. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he thought evolution worked through a process that he called inheritance of acquired characteristics. Basically, it was an idea that parents acquire traits during their lifetime, and they can then pass those acquired traits on to their offspring. So his example was that giraffes kind of started with this short neck, but they couldn't reach the leaves that were high up on the tree. So they would just stretch their necks out. And over the course of their lifetime, they would be able to just stretch the neck longer and longer. And then those giraffes that could stretch their necks that long over their lifetime, they would be able to reach the food. They would have enough energy. They would be able to reproduce. It doesn't work like that, though. All right. You can't. Parents can not pass on acquired traits to their offspring because all of our traits that we pass to our offspring are in our sex cells, right? Either the egg if you are biologically female, sperm if you're biologically male. So even if a giraffe did or a human did acquire some kind of trait during their lifetime, that would not be passed on to their offspring because it's not in their sex cells. It's funny. So, around the same time, Charles Darwin was thinking about how things evolve, and he settled on this idea of natural selection, that all organisms in a population are not the same. Some organisms have better traits than others, and those that have the better trait will survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits to their offspring. The organisms that did not have the better trait will die because they cannot compete with the more fit organisms. So, for example, we've got some birds here that they're eating these beetles here, and right, they're able to see the green beetles easier than they can see the orange ones. So the orange ones are blending in more easily with their environment, and the green ones are standing out. So the more fit beetle is the orange one. So a few generations later, right, we can see there are more orange beetles because they're surviving and reproducing, and there are fewer green beetles because not all of them are surviving, right? They're getting eaten by the predator here. And then if even a few more generations later, we end up with most of the population of beetles being orange because the green beetles have been selected against, and these orangish brown beetles have flourished because they're more fit for this environment. They're blending in, and so they are not getting preyed upon as easily as the green beetles. So Darwin called this natural selection, right? Nature will select which trait is the best for that environment. A good example is the peppered moths in England. There are two peppered moths, one right here and right here on this left side. They are incredibly hard to see. But then if I come over here, right, the same peppered moth from right here that is so easily blending in is much, much more easy to see on this black background, and the black moth stands right out. So if nature changes, if the environment changes, right, natural selection can change as well. So in this first environment, this peppered moth, the black and white speckled moth, is definitely more fit than a plain black moth, because this black moth over here on this left side would stand out super easy, and it would get eaten by a bird probably immediately. But the environment changed, right? The bark became really, really dark, and so now the peppered moth will be selected against, and the black moth will survive more easily and it will reproduce. So natural selection is picking the trait that is best suited for that environment. And if the environment changes, then natural selection will change. Last thing we're going to talk about is the endosymbiotic theory, basically stating where the origins of eukaryotes came from. Because we talked about at the beginning, right? Prokaryotes were the first living things on Earth, but that begs the question, where did eukaryotes came from? So the theory of endosymbiosis, right, is that a large cell with a nucleus engulfed smaller bacteria that began to live inside the larger cell. So let's break this down a little bit. So endo, right, meaning into, and then symbi, meaning kind of like symbiotic, so basically living together, right, and then endo meaning into. So basically this large prokaryote, it engulfed, right, smaller bacteria right? So it's engulfing it. Those smaller bacteria, right, that got engulfed by the bigger one, they survived. They decided to live inside the larger cell, and so they became endosymbiotic. The larger cell and the smaller cells, right, grew dependent on one another. So the smaller prokaryotic cells that got engulfed became what we know today as the organelles mitochondria and chloroplast. So a couple million years ago, mitochondria and chloroplast were their own individual prokaryotic cells, but they were very small. And so a larger prokaryotic cell came along, ate them, but they survived, right? They were not destroyed by the lysosomes. They stayed inside that larger cell. And because they survived, right, the mitochondria producing all of this energy for the larger cell, they were like, hey, I'm benefiting here. I'm getting all this energy. And the mitochondria, right, the smaller prokaryotic cell was like, hey, I got eaten, but I didn't die. I think I'll stay here for protection. So eukaryotic cells came from these larger prokaryotic cells engulfing smaller prokaryotic cells, and then they decided to live together. So endosymbiont theory. That is it for these notes on the history of life. If you have any questions or concerns about anything from these notes, please be sure to let me know. Thanks.